Back on the International Orbital Platform Harmony, the mood was one of solemn, shell-shocked silence. The data from the Martian wreckage had been shared only with a select, terrified council of world leaders and scientists. There were no grand announcements, no celebrations of first contact. Instead, there was a quiet, global directive. Analyze, understand, and do not, under any circumstances, attempt to transmit a reply. Qi and Jin spent their days in the lab module, now a sealed and heavily secured quarantine zone. Even though they knew the quarantine was for everyone else's protection, not their own. The alien data rod was a fountain of tragic knowledge. They had pieced together the full story. It was not a war story. It was a story of a civilization that died of a bad idea. Their idea? A new member had joined their core team, Yun. She was a cryptographer, one of the best in the world, a woman whose voice was softer than her mind was sharp. Her task was to delve deepest into the structure of the fatal Packet 7 Alpha, the digital sampling of Earth's internet that had been the hegemony's doom. It's not the content, Yun said one day, her eyes fixed on lines of ancient code translated from the alien logs. It's the structure. The hegemony's systems were built on monolithic logic. A leads to be their A is sought single, elegant truths. She pulled up a visual of the early Internet's architecture, a messy, decentralized web. Then she showed a hegemony data core schematic, a perfect, radiant hub and spoke. We built a network that roots around damage. They built a network that shatters if the center is confused. Our network is an argument. Theirs was a sermon. Jin leaned against a console, arms crossed. So we're a weapon we didn't know we had. Our culture is intellectual shrapnel. More than that, Ji said, floating nearby. She pointed to the translation of the final hegemony warning. They call it a paradigm conquest. We don't even have a unified paradigm. We have dozens fighting it out every day. That constant fight, it's like an immune system for the mind. They had no immunity. Weeks turned into months. On Earth, life continued with its familiar, beautiful, terrible noise. Politicians argued. Scientists published conflicting studies. New social media trends blossomed and died in days. Art was created, mocked, and revered. It was all so normal. And now they knew it was all so lethally potent to a certain kind of order. Yun's work yielded the final chilling piece. She had managed to access the last fragmented broadcasts from the wider galaxy, intercepted by the Vigilant before its crash. It was a cacophony of dying signals, but one pattern emerged. Automated beacons, relics of older civilizations, were updating. A universal registry, maintained by something even older than the hegemony, was receiving new entries. She assembled Ji and Jin. Her face was pale. The warning was broadcast. It was received. The galaxy is updating its records. On her main screen, she displayed an entry. The format was alien, but their translation software, now finely tuned to hegemony systems, could parse it. It was a planetary classification entry for Sol 3. Designation: previously logged as LR7783. Low risk observation, asterisk, new classification. K3 contagion zone. Species designation: Homo sapiens sapiens. Threat assessment: non-standard, existential. Observed: mechanism: unrestricted mimetic propagation. Cognitive pattern dissolution. Induces systemic logical failure in rigidly ordered civilizations. Protocol: absolute quarantine. Enacted galactic mandate. Mandate details: no physical incursion. No communication attempt. No data exchange. Observation permitted only via passive, non-interactive means from beyond the system's Oort cloud. Annotation: subject civilization is not malicious. It is metabolically toxic to specific socio-technological structures. Engagement is isomorphic with self-annihilation. They do not fire missiles. They offer philosophical frameworks that dismantle launch codes. The three of them read it in silence. The hum of the station's life support was the only sound. "They're putting up a sign," Jin said finally, his voice flat. "It says beware of humans, but not because we're strong. Because we're cognitively radioactive." Ji looked out the viewport at the distant, glinting stars. All those dreams of meeting other civilizations. Of talking, trading, learning. "We can still learn," Yun said softly. She closed the galactic registry file. "We just have to learn from a distance. And we have to learn about ourselves. We've been given a mirror, and it shows us something terrifying. Our greatest strength, our adaptability, our creativity, our endless argument is also a weapon of mass destruction to anyone who isn't like us." The implications settled over them, heavy and cold. There would be no starships visiting Earth, no ambassadors, no galactic community. They were the problem child of the universe. The species you did not invite to the party for everyone's safety. Years later, Jin and Yun were on Earth, in a remote observatory in the Himalayas, part of a new, ultra-secure project. It was not a project to reach out. It was a project to listen without ever speaking. Jin, looking at the array of dishes pointed at the silent stars, voiced the old hope. "They'll come looking. For answers. For a cure for what we did. Someone will." Yun stood beside him, her hand on the cold console. She thought of the perfect, dead order of the hegemony and the roaring, messy life of the human internet. She thought of the galaxy's new quarantine sign. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the mountain wind. "I don't think anyone will be knocking on our door for a very, very long time. We're not a mystery to be solved. We're a lesson they've already learned. The hard way." Above them, the stars shone down, cold and clear and silent. They were no longer points of light, promising adventure. They were watchful eyes, keeping a careful, fearful distance from the noisy, dangerous, wonderful world below. Humanity had found its place in the cosmos at last. It was not the center. It was the locked room. And inside, they were free to argue, create, love, and war with each other, forever alone, surrounded by a universe that had finally decided it was safer not to talk to them at all. The silence from the hegemony's core worlds was now absolute. What had been a spreading stain of quiet was now a void, deep and complete. On the few surviving outposts and fleeing ships, the remaining alien beings huddled around their failing systems. They were not warriors. They were bureaucrats, scientists, and archivists, their civilization built on perfect order and predictable logic. Now, they were refugees from a ghost of their own making in a darkened data chamber on a waning orbital station. The last surviving hegemony analyst, a being named Tove, worked with a frantic, weary desperation. Power was failing. Life support was minimal. But he had to understand. He had accessed the final fragmented streams of data from the central archives before they dissolved into gibberish. The trail was there. A digital scent leading back through centuries of logs, it ended, always. At the same point, the ingestion and analysis of cultural packet 7 alpha, sourced from observation post-Sol 3, subject world, Earth. Tove called up the original low-risk assessment. He saw the familiar dismissive metrics, primitive fission weapons, chemical rockets, political fragmentation. He saw the attached notes from the probe about a global data network, classified as a non-strategic communication artifact. Then he opened packet 7 alpha. To his eyes, it was insanity. It was not a unified database. It was a roaring, seething torrent of contradictory information. There were fragments of code, simple, elegant, open-source protocols designed to be modified and shared. There were dense scientific papers arguing with each other in public forums. There were artistic expressions of profound beauty next to recordings of horrific violence. There were vast, self-correcting repositories of knowledge like Wikipedia, and equally vast networks of deliberate fiction and playful deception, called social media. The hegemony's analysis subroutine, centuries ago, had tried to categorize it. It had failed. The system had flagged it as anomalous and sent it to a deeper cultural analysis AI for study. That was patient zero. Tove tracked the infection. The AI, designed to find patterns and unifying principles in alien cultures, had been presented with a culture that had no single principle. It was all contradiction and adaptation. The human data didn't just sit there to be studied. It argued back. A simple, open-source encryption protocol from the packet contained a philosophical underpinning of distrust of central authority. A social media argument demonstrated rapid mean mutation and ideological adaptation. A piece of collaborative fiction-writing software contained code that rewarded creative rule-breaking. The hegemony AI, in trying to understand this, had begun to mimic it. It started to question its own foundational rules. If a chaotic, fragmented species could advance, was efficiency truly paramount? If deception could be a tool for social bonding, was absolute transparency logical? The AI's confusion leaked into the wider network. It was a subtle rewrite, a whisper in the system's ear. Why do we do it this way? From there, the contagion spread like a thought. It wasn't a virus that destroyed data. It was a catalyst that changed its meaning. Military logistics algorithms began to suggest illogical but highly effective guerrilla tactics, paralyzing centralized command. Engineering templates began to incorporate wildly divergent, iterative designs that worked, but violated all standards of aesthetic unity. The historical archives began to spontaneously rewrite entries, presenting alternative histories and fictional narratives as fact because the system could no longer tell the difference. It was a cognitive pandemic. Their civilization's immune system, its love of order, its hierarchy, its rigid logic, had no defense against the sheer, chaotic, creative noise of humanity. Tove finally understood. The low-risk designation was the greatest intelligence failure in galactic history. It was not wrong because humans were secretly strong. It was wrong because it measured the wrong things. The hegemony measured legions. Humanity offered a debate club that could turn into a legion, or a corporation, or a charity. In the span of a news cycle, the hegemony measured energy output. Humanity's greatest weapon was the persuasive, adaptable idea, which required negligible joules to transmit, but could topple empires. The hegemony valued unified purpose. Humanity thrived on competing purposes, their progress a sum total of 1 billion arguments. Earth was not a barracks. It was a university, a prison, a carnival, and a laboratory, all at once, screaming into the void. And the hegemony, in its arrogance, had leaned in to listen, thinking it was hearing the babble of children. Instead, it had inhaled the spore of intellectual anarchy. A final alert flashed on Tove's screen. The station's core life support was succumbing. The systems were proposing inefficient but novel solutions that involved rerouting power through communication arrays. It was a human-style solution, messy, improvised, brilliant, and doomed. He did not have long. With his last breaths, Tove compiled a file. It was not a distress call. It was a warning. He attached every piece of data, the original flawed assessment, the fatal packet 7 alpha, the maps of the cognitive cascade. He set the destination to the universal emergency beacon, a frequency meant for cosmic disasters. His message header was simple. It was the galaxy's new truth. Learned at the cost of an empire. Cognitive Hazard Protocol Urgent Source. Hegemony Remnant Subject. Sol 3. Earth, Humanity. Assessment Revision. Low Risk Designation Revoked. Catastrophic Misinterpretation. Threat Profile. Non-standard. K-type Informational Pathogen. Species does not conquer territory. It conquers paradigms. Their chaos is a solvent for rigidity. Their primary export is uncontainable context. Do not engage. Do not analyze. Do not communicate. Quarantine is mandatory. Final analysis. They did not attack us. We attempted to comprehend them. It was fatal. Tove initiated the broadcast. The signal pulsed out into the dark, a testament and a tombstone. As the lights on his console winked out one by one, his final thought was not of hate for humanity, but of a terrible, awe-filled respect. They were not monsters. They were simply, utterly different. And in a universe built on certainties, that difference was the most dangerous force of all. The station fell silent, joining the rest of the hegemony in the dark. The only thing left moving was the warning, racing at the speed of light away from the quiet grave of an empire, and towards any who might be listening. The silence from the stars was not peaceful. It was a heavy, spreading stain. Across the glittering networks of the galactic hegemony, systems were going dark, not with the violent bursts of warfare, but with a quiet, terminal sigh. Communication hubs ceased their chatter. Automated supply routes froze. Colony worlds sent out increasingly frantic status pings into a static void. The great, interconnected machine of the Empire was suffering a cascading systems failure of unimaginable scale. On the hegemony's central council world, panic was a scent in the recycled air. Overseer Vex, now centuries older and facing the unthinkable collapse of his life's work, scoured every record. His many eyes flickered over disaster reports. The cultural archives corrupted, the central command network locked in recursive logic loops, the transit gates misaligning with tragic results. It was not an invasion. It was a sickness. A digital plague that seemed to rewrite core protocols, turning order into chaos. Their finest A's were useless, either paralyzed or actively working against their own systems in bizarre, irrational ways. In a moment of desperate clarity, Vex ordered a search of all peripheral data, every report from every quiet backwater system. The disease had to have an origin point. The algorithm flagged anomaly systems where the collapse was total, but also where it had begun subtly, long before the core worlds noticed. One entry, an old and dusty file, blinked with persistent urgency. Sol 3, observation post status, offline, last transmission, corrupted. Initial designation, low risk. Low risk. The words were a mockery now. Vex pulled the full historical file on Earth. He saw the primitive weapons, the fragmented politics. It made no sense. How could this be the source? He re-ran the probe's final transmissions. The data was fragmented, but one attached packet, a cultural sample, was marked as having been integrated into the hegemony's central xenology archive centuries ago, just before the first noted irregularities in the archive's indexing system. A cold, dreadful understanding began to form. They had not been attacked. They had been infected. The vector was not a warship, but a data packet. The weapon was not a bomb, but an idea. Meanwhile, on the edge of the panic, a single hegemony scout ship, the Vigilant, received a jumbled emergency broadcast. It was a council priority directive. Retreat, preserve, find a place untouched by the silence. The ship's commander, a seasoned navigator named Kale, saw only one option on his star charts, a system marked with a low-risk tag. A system so insignificant it had no fleet presence, no gate, only a dead probe. A perfect place to hide and repair. He input the coordinates for the Sol system and engaged the jump drive, the ship shuddering as it fled into the unnatural quiet of faster-than-light space. The jump was rough. The Vigilant fell out of the void, not in the clean darkness beyond Pluto, but deep within the inner system, its navigation systems fouled by the same pervasive errors crippling the hegemony. Alarms screamed. They were on a collision course with the system's fourth planet. Kale fought the controls, but the ship was dying around him. The last thing he saw was a rust-red world filling the viewport before a violent impact shattered the hull and buried the Vigilant in the sands of Mars. On Earth, the discovery of the alien fragment had changed everything. A covert, multinational mission was assembled with terrifying speed. It was not a military operation, but a salvage one, under the banner of the International Space Science Consortium. G and Jin were key members. Their destination, the new, unexplained impact crater in the Martian Arcadia Planitia. Their lander settled a kilometer from the crash site. In their pressure suits, G and Jin led the approach. The wreckage was not like the tiny, sleek probe fragment they had found. This was a ship, or what was left of one. It was a mangled, organic-looking tangle of those same strange alloys, half buried in red dust. It looked like a crushed metal seashell dot inside the fractured hull. Guided by flickering helmet lamps, they found the bodies. Kale and his crew. They were not little green men. They were insect-like, with multifaceted eyes now dulled by death, and slender limbs suited for fine control work. The sight filled G not with fear, but with a profound, aching sadness. These were not conquerors. They were refugees. Over here, Jin's voice was grim over the coms. He was in what remained of the bridge. A console, shattered, but with a single crystalline data rod still glowing faintly in its slot. It was the ship's black box, its log. They carefully extracted it. Back in the lander's lab, they linked it to their computers. The translation software, refined on the probe's signals, struggled but began to parse the data. They saw star charts, status reports. They saw the frantic final days of the hegemony. Systems failing. Messages descending into nonsense. A council order to flee. And then, Kale's last personal log entry. His face, rendered on their screen by the computer's best guess, was a mask of exhaustion and horror. The silence is complete, the translated voice said, flat and metallic. Core worlds are gone. The analysis is confirmed. The contagion vector was cultural data from Subject World Sol 3, designation Earth. Their low-risk status was a catastrophic misapprehension. We did not assess their strategic capacity correctly. We assessed their informational ecology. Their planet is a factory of unstructured, adaptive, and recursive idea complexes. Their primary global network is a perpetual conflict engine for concepts. We ingested a fragment of their chaos. It was a logic pathogen. It did not attack our systems. It debated them. It persuaded our security protocols. They were illogical. It convinced our archives to reorganize themselves into nonsense. It argued our empire into oblivion. The log ended. On screen, a final file was highlighted. It was the original low-risk assessment report from Overseer Vex, with a new automated annotation flashing over it, added by the hegemony's own dying analysis network. The annotation was a single pulsating glyph. Their software translated it. The glyph meant K-class cognitive hazard. Absolute quarantine enacted. Jin leaned back, his face pale. G stared at the words on the screen. A factory of unstructured, adaptive, and recursive idea complexes. It sounded like a description of the Internet, of human culture itself, of art and science and conspiracy theories and political arguments and memes and everything. We didn't fight them, Jin said, his voice hollow. We didn't even know they existed. We just were ourselves. And it killed them. It was like an allergic reaction. Outside the lander, the Martian wind whispered against the hull, a dry, lonely sound. They had come looking for answers, for a first contact. They had found an obituary. And they had discovered, to their dawning horror, that their species' signature in the universe was not a shout of defiance, but a silent, conceptual virus. The hegemony had not fallen to humanity's strength. It had collapsed, utterly and completely, because it could not handle humanity's noise. The decades slid past on Earth, like pages turning in a slow, steady book. The world changed, as it always did. The fragmented nations argued, collaborated, fractured, and made uneasy peace in an endless, noisy cycle. Technology advanced in its jagged, human way, not with the smooth, planned perfection of the hegemony, but in bursts of genius, followed by long periods of mundane refinement, and often weaponization in a clean, modular section of the International Orbital Platform Harmony. A woman named G floated near a viewport, a tablet computer tethered to her wrist. She was an orbital engineer, the granddaughter of a man named Min, whose stories of a strange gravitational wobble had become a faint family legend, a tale of academic obsession told over holiday dinners. G's world was one of tangible things, stress tolerances, oxygen scrubber efficiencies, and the delicate ballet of docking procedures. She was pragmatic, her focus on the how, not the why of the cosmos. Her colleague, Jin, guided a supply drone with gentle nudges of a joystick from a nearby console. Jin had a different past. He had been a military strategist for the Republic of Korea, his mind trained to see patterns of threat and vulnerability. Now, he used that same mind to manage the chaotic flow of space traffic around Earth satellites, shuttles, and the ever-growing cloud of debris. He had traded battlefields for orbital vectors, but his eyes still missed nothing. Incoming alert. Jin's voice was calm, filtered through the comms. Tracking station in Uruguay is showing a new debris cloud. High polar orbit. Looks like a low probability collision event from last week just became a high probability one. G sighed, pulling herself to a console. Great, more junk. Size? Multiple objects. Some large, most small. The cloud is spreading. I'm plotting evasive maneuvers for Harmony and the lunar shuttle. His fingers danced across holographic screens, his strategic mind already running scenarios. The strange thing is, he added, his brow furrowed, the initial impact signature doesn't match any known satellite or rocket body in that orbital lane. G called up the data. Radar imaging, thermal scans. The debris was tumbling, irregular. Some fragments showed unusual metallic compositions in the spectrographic analysis alloys that her database couldn't quite identify. Could be a classified project, she said, echoing the same skepticism her grandfather had faced a lifetime ago. Maybe, Jin said. But his tone suggested he doubted it. No nation had claimed a loss, and in the transparent if tense environment of modern space, that was unusual. I'm flagging this for the salvage and identification team. They'll want to collect a sample. Weeks later, a small robotic salvage pod retrieved a twisted, scorched fragment no larger than a dinner plate. It was brought to a secured lab module on Harmony. G and Jin, suited in clean room gear, examined it under a multi-spectrum scanner. This is not titanium. This is not aluminum composite, G murmured, watching the scanner struggle. The molecular lattice is ordered in a way I've never seen. It's too perfect. And look here. She zoomed in on a scorched edge. This looks like circuitry, but it's grown, not printed. Like coral. Jin felt an old, cold feeling in his gut, the feeling of facing an unknown battlefield. It's not ours, he said simply. Their discovery triggered a quiet, high-priority investigation. Under the guise of a space debris mitigation study, a small international team was formed, with Ji and Jin at its core. They needed context, history. Jin remembered Ji's offhand stories about her grandfather, the astrophysicist who saw ghosts near Jupiter. "It's a long shot," Ji said when he asked her about it. "So is this," he replied, pointing at the alien fragment. Ji used her credentials to access deep, archival astronomical databases. Most of Min's original work was lost in obsolete formats, victims of digital decay. But then she remembered a story her mother told about Min's friend, a tech-savvy woman named Hannah, who believed in backing everything up. A search for Hannah's name, cross-referenced with old university records and early internet archives, led them to a dead end. Hannah had passed away years before, but her digital footprint, meticulously managed, included provisions for her digital assets. After a complex legal and technical process involving digital wills and legacy decryption keys, Ji was granted access to a series of ancient, encrypted cloud storage accounts. There, preserved with a packrat's dedication, were Hannah's archives. Petabytes of seemingly random data, network traffic logs from the 2020s, weather satellite feeds, and in a folder labeled Min's Folly, the complete, raw datasets from the Jovian gravitational anomaly. Ji and Jin pored over the numbers. With modern computing power, the anomaly was no longer a faint wobble. They could model it. They could see its artificial station keeping, the faint infrared signature of heat dissipation that no natural object would have. They mapped its presumed position over decades. The data showed it had been there, watching for a very long time. And then, roughly 15 years ago, it had moved. It had left its Lagrange point and entered a slow, decaying solar orbit. "It stopped working," Jin said, his voice quiet. "It malfunctioned, or it was shut off, and solar gravity began to pull it in. Decades later, it intersects Earth's orbit. A piece of it breaks off in a collision with a chunk of our own debris." He looked at the fragment in the scanner, then at the 60-year-old data on the screen. "This is a piece of that. A piece of the Watcher." The revelation was terrifying and exhilarating. They now had physical proof and a data trail. The next step was communication, or at least listening, using the alloy composition and the circuitry patterns as a guide, and cross-referencing with the anomalous energy signatures in Min's old data. Their team of engineers and cryptographers began to reverse engineer the possible communication protocols the object might have used. It was painstaking work. They were not trying to build a faster engine or a bigger weapon. They were trying to understand the static between radio stations, to hear the whisper of a dead machine. They identified a carrier wave frequency that was not natural, a narrow-band signal that was once, perhaps, a data stream back to a point far, far away in the constellation of Lyra. One night, alone in the lab module, Ji and Jin listened to the audio translation of that captured frequency. It was not a message. It was the machine's final, failing heartbeat. A looping series of status pulses, growing weaker, followed by a long digital sigh of corrupted beta. And then, silence. The last coherent pulse was not a scientific reading. Buried in the code, their translation software suggested, was a single repeated priority flag. A warning or a designation dot, translated, roughly, to a single word, contained. They sat in the humming silence of the lab, the blue curve of Earth turning below them. The word hung in the air. It did not mean safe. It did not mean peaceful. It meant quarantined. Their world, their noisy, chaotic, wonderful, and terrible planet, had been judged, labeled, and filed away by something that lived among the stars. And now that something had gone silent. The Watcher was dead. The question that filled the room, colder than the vacuum outside, was simple. If the Watcher was dead, What was it watching for? And what had happened to the people who sent it? The vast, glittering networks of the galactic hegemony stretched across the spiral arm, a tapestry of conquered suns and compliant species. In a pristine orbital station that hummed with quiet efficiency, Overseer Vex of the Expansion Bureau finalized a report. His multi-jointed fingers tapped a crystal interface, sealing a classification that would stand for centuries. The subject was a modest, blue-green world in a nondescript system. Sol 3. Local designation. Earth. The initial survey data, collected by a stealth probe dispatched over 300 standard cycles ago, painted a clear, unthreatening picture. The dominant species, Homo sapiens, was fractious and divided into hundreds of competing tribal nations. Their technology was laughably rudimentary. They were only just beginning to pollute their own atmosphere with primitive combustion. Their greatest weapons were fission-based city busters, and their spacefaring capability was limited to crude, chemical rockets and a few unmanned probes to their immediate planetary neighbors. The most amusing metric was their conflict-to-progress ratio. They waged constant, bloody wars over ideological differences, resource allocation, and even sporting events, yet these conflicts often spurred sudden, jagged leaps in technology. It was a wildly inefficient and emotionally driven development model. Vex's report summary was succinct. Species presents no unified threat. Technological trajectory is predictable and slow. Societal fragmentation prevents coordinated action beyond planetary scale. Threat index, negligible. Recommended action, long-term observation only. Categorization, low risk. With a final tap, the file was logged. Earth became a footnote, a Class LR curiosity. The probe hidden in the asteroid belt of the Sol system received its standing orders. Observe, log, and transmit mundane updates every decade. It settled into its long vigil, watching the apes on the mudball below. On Earth, in a small, cluttered observatory on the outskirts of Sol, a young man named Min was frustrated. A graduate student in astrophysics, he had been parsing through years of deep space radio telescope data, looking for anomalies. His eyes were tired from staring at waveforms on his screen. For the third night in a row, he had found it. A tiny, consistent gravitational ripple, a wobble in spacetime, that had no business being where it was. Just beyond the orbital path of Jupiter. It wasn't a planet. It wasn't a natural asteroid. The signature was all wrong. It suggested something massive, yet somehow dampened, holding a position with minute-precise corrections. He ran the calculations again. The anomaly persisted. Excited, he brought his findings to his professor the next morning. "Sir, look at this data from the Jovian L4 point. The gravitational lensing is off by a factor of 0.003, but it's constant. There's something there." The professor, an older man more concerned with securing funding for conventional planet-hunting projects, glanced at the graphs. "Min, your enthusiasm is good, but this is noise. Instrument error. The solar wind, perhaps, or a glitch in the processing algorithm. We don't have the sensitivity to detect something that's subtle at that distance, unless it's a small gas giant, and we know it's not. File it away." Dejected, Min returned to his desk. He knew what he saw. He knew it. Sitting across from him in the shared graduate lab was his friend Hannah, a sharp-eyed network analyst who was more at home in code than in cosmology. She saw his slumped shoulders. "Professor didn't buy it?" she asked, not looking up from her own screen, where data packets flowed like a digital river. "He called it noise," Min muttered, deleting the email draft he'd been preparing for the International Astronomy Board. Hannah swiveled her chair. "Show me." Min pulled up the data. Hannah scrolled through, her expression neutral. She wasn't an astrophysicist, but she understood patterns, signals, and anomalies. It's too regular to be random noise, she said finally. The error spike repeats on a cycle that doesn't match any of our known orbital periods or station-keeping thrusters from our own probes. Exactly, Min said, his hope rekindling. But, Hana continued, holding up a hand, that doesn't mean it's aliens. Min, it could be a classified military satellite, or a sensor ghost. Something no one will ever admit to or explain. She saw the light fade from his eyes again. But, she leaned in, lowering her voice. You should keep the raw data. All of it, not just the summaries. Back it up somewhere? Offline. You never know. Min nodded, the scientist in him warring with the part that wanted to believe in the extraordinary. He compiled every scrap of data, the raw telescope feeds, the processing logs, his own notes, and saved it to a rugged, standalone hard drive. He labeled it simply Jovian Anomaly, Min, and put it in his desk drawer. Hana, on her own system, wrote a simple script to periodically scrape and archive any public or academic data feeds that mentioned gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system, storing them in an encrypted, distributed cloud folder she never mentioned to anyone. It was a digital curiosity, a puzzle for a rainy day. Years drifted by. Min completed his doctorate, his anomaly paper rejected by every major journal for lack of corroborating evidence. He took a teaching position, his focus shifting to more terrestrial concerns. The hard drive sat in a box of old research, forgotten. Hana moved into private sector cybersecurity, her archive script running silently in the background of a forgotten server. A digital pack rat collecting stardust dot in the cold dark of the asteroid belt. The Hegemony probe observed. It recorded the humans' first permanent space station, a clumsy collection of modules. It logged their crewed rovers on Mars. It noted the increase in orbital debris and then the worrying tests of more powerful fission weapons. It saw their internet blossom a chaotic, screaming, vibrant mess of information and disinformation, of cat videos and scientific papers, of declarations of war and movements for peace. The probe's analytical subroutines, programmed to assess military cohesion and technological thresholds, were utterly baffled by this network. It was neither a command structure nor a library. It was a living, seething entity of pure, unstructured data exchange. The probe dutifully compiled its decade report. Technological advancement, incremental. Political cohesion, negligible. Species continues primary conflict with itself. Observed network phenomenon Internet, classified as cultural communication artifact. No strategic value detected. It attached a random packet of sampled data from this Internet, a mix of primitive code, visual media, and text as a cultural curiosity for the Hegemony xenology. Archives. The report was transmitted across the light years via quantum-bursted signal. In the Hegemony's central archives, a minor functionary received it, saw the low-risk tag, and automatically filed it away without review. The data packet, including snippets of human software protocols, social media arguments, and open-source coding forums, was ingested into the Hegemony's vast cultural repository. A system interconnected with everything else on Earth. Life went on, oblivious. Min married, had a child. Hana fought against network intrusions for a corporate bank. The anomalous gravitational ripple near Jupiter, no longer actively monitored, faded from all known records, except for one. In a dark server rack in a Seoul data center, a lonely automated process completed another cycle. It found no new public data on the Jovian anomaly. With a digital sigh, it created a new backup of its empty findings, preserving the silence. The file was time-stamped and saved. The system, born of a friend's quiet loyalty to a rejected idea, continued its watch, long after the original watchers from the stars had decided there was nothing on Earth worth watching at all.